thank you everyone for coming, for signing in. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Barry Cranford. I'm the founder of the Fractional Consultant Community, which is a new group. We only just started it in December, and it's already grown to about 400 people, which is nice. We had our first unconference on Wednesday. I know a bunch of you were there, and it was good fun. And so we're just doing a few sessions where we're bringing together people that I've met and come across and respect in various different areas to share opinions and answer some questions. So today is all about hiring, and we have Khalil Dimachkie and Ryan Greenhall. Khalil, do you want to just say a few words to introduce yourself and then maybe move over to Ryan?
Sure, yeah. So hi, I'm Khalil, as mentioned. So I've been in the kind of tech industry in London for about 18 years now. Done kind of work on the whole stack, really, development-wise. Moved into kind of the more strategic side of things about 12, 14 years ago. And I think probably the last 10 years have been in leadership positions, 8 of those as CTO. And I've recently transitioned into Fractional. I've got my first couple of clients. And I was doing Interim before that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Khalil. Appreciate that. And Ryan, did you want to just say a few words?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Ryan Greenhall. So I operate as a fractional interim CTO with 2 main offerings. So I help startups that have found product market fit scale sustainably across people, process, platform, and products. I like to think of it as bringing sort of order and structure to the chaos in those environments, and also help establish companies that maybe wouldn't have ordinarily thought themselves as technology companies that now have become technology companies or depend on technology, and help them break down sort of business and IT divides, restructure around business value streams, and essentially bring modern software engineering practices to accelerate delivery. I've been in sort of perm engineering leadership positions for the last decade in a variety of contexts through privately funded VC, PE-backed companies, and been fortunate to help drive 3 exits in that period. And hiring and building high-performing teams has been a huge focus for me and the bedrock of my success over the last 10 years. And so delighted to share my experiences here today with you all.
Brilliant. Thanks, Khalil. And thanks, Ryan. Okay, so for everyone here, like realistically, the most we want to, or the biggest thing we want to have happen here is for those of you that are actually on the call to get what you want to get out of it. So if you've got any questions or anything that you want to add, feel free to put the virtual hand up, put the question in the chat there, and we'll try and get to that. We've got a few questions that have been submitted and a few to get through, but feel free at any point to interrupt the narrative and put your questions out there. So we'll start off with then what it looks like from your world. So I think, Ryan, Khalil, if you can think here, we've got a bunch of people on the call that are aspiring fractionals. Obviously, we've got some current, but we've got a lot of people that are just coming into this space. So looking to find out what it might look like from your world and to learn from existing fractionals what the world of hiring kind of looks like. So at what point, like, is this always a feature in the gigs that you've had? Is it always something that you come across? How quickly do you have to get involved? And what does that world look like from your side?
Yeah, I'm happy to start off on this one. So from my perspective, it has always been part of the role, and it typically comes up very early. It comes up when you're engaging with an initial client, and if hiring or team capability is sort of part of their problem, then they'll bring it up very, very quickly. So that often part of the brief will be, okay, we're looking to scale the business. Our current team is X. We think we need, X, a team that looks like this. So even in those sort of early engagement calls, you're starting to build up a picture of, what the kind of problems that they have. And in terms of the practicalities, it's actually very similar to when you're doing it as a perm engineering leader. You'll be engaging very, very closely with the engineering teams to sort of quickly build up a picture of the capabilities, what's missing, and working very closely with in-house sort of talent teams. So in my experience, it is very common, and it doesn't look that much different from a perm role. The differentiating factor is you need to sell the mission of the company over selling yourself, which you should probably be selling the mission of the company even if you're in a perm role.
Yeah, I think much like Ryan, actually, I'm quite focused on startups and scale-ups, and that's where a lot of my experience has been. So, a natural part of that is going to be that there's a real need for hiring, and there's kind of a need to kind of look at the whole hiring strategy and actually staffing strategy, right? So what I find myself involved in a lot is actually also coming in and figuring out, do they have the right idea in terms of hiring? What types of profiles are they bringing on? Is the mix, is there a need to hire perms, or can we kind of temporarily scale up with more contract based? Or is sometimes what I found as well is too much contract, and we have a lot of the internal knowledge kind of dissipating away from the company. So a lot of what I find myself involved in is, rather than the day-to-day hiring process, is more kind of a review of the whole strategy of hiring and how to approach that. Especially when it comes to interim and fractional, because I think that's where you can make kind of the biggest impact as well, rather than, embed yourself deeply within the hiring process itself.
Okay, Mark, I can see you've got your hand up there. I'll come to you in just 1 second. Just before I do that, then do you ever have pushbacks? Like when you come in as a permanent leader, obviously it's kind of your team and you'll assume control of that. But when you're there as a fractional or as an interim, obviously a part of that means that you're not going to be there forever. So do you ever have much pushback from the team in terms of, you can see the problems one way, but they're kind of like, what do you know? You're brand new, you don't know as much as we do. Do you ever get that kind of friction? And if you do, how do you handle that kind of thing?
Well, personally, I find that you actually get less friction than when you're a firm, because people are kind of bringing you on because of your expertise, because they need that fresh perspective. So as long as kind of when you're coming in, you're establishing that, look, I'm here to review everything and I'm bringing a bunch of experience with me, it tends to be easier to convince people to go a certain way. Maybe it's also because they're paying you as kind of like what they consider a consultant. But I actually find it easier to get buy-in than when you're a firm.
Yeah, I build on that in the sense that I think as long as you're talking to the teams and you're listening, you can then layer on your own perspectives, and people will respect your opinion, and ultimately, if they, if you're there to provide a fresh perspective, and I had a recent example where I saw the initial hiring plan. And actually, had to go back and say, actually, you're hiring too many people. I propose we hire less people, but we go for more experience and essentially, have more impact that way, rather than hiring 20 people that are going to need a lot of support. So sometimes that fresh insight can really help an existing organization, because when you're in the day-to-day and you've been looking at this plan for maybe 6 months, it's harder to pick holes in it. So the fresh perspective really helps.
Yeah, I've had that same conversation, by the way, let's hire more experienced senior people first and then build up the rest of the team. Because what I find is they shift a lot more work faster, but also it's higher quality work that you need to revisit less. So you're reducing the technical debt as you're doing that. So the cost optimization is actually positive. You're paying them a bit more, but you're having to redo a lot less stuff, and you're sticking to roadmap a lot more.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. Right, Mark, I see you've had your hand up for a while. So yeah, something you wanted to ask there?
Thanks, Barry. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, it's more of a general question about the session in general, I suppose, because when I saw building teams as a fractional, compared to being permanent, for example, there's a couple of things that kind of stood out for me. There's let's call it a tenuous link between building, as in from the ground up, especially in a startup, if you have nobody or you inherit, for example, a development agency and you're building internally. But then, either building from the ground up or inheriting a small team and then growing that in terms of numbers, but also growing in terms of individuals and teams as a group in terms of their, knowledge, experience, call it kind of mentoring, if you like. So, I mean, the main query for me, I suppose, when you're fractional, are there any kind of, not so much shortcut, but quicker methods that you have found that helps in terms of building teams, either in terms of recruiting and in terms of, individual and team, experience, if you like? Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. So for me, it's been around. Let's say you're in a position where you join an organization and the level of technical leadership in place isn't as strong as it needs to be. So some techniques I've applied is, try and find a couple of really high leverage hires. So can you find a couple of really sort of very experienced principal engineers that can then, take on those bigger technical leadership roles, do a lot of coaching with the teams? It's like, how can you, because certainly as a fractional, you may not be there, you might be there sort of half the week. So you need to, it's all around how can you build that strong permanent team that are complementing you, and you're focusing on the things that only you can do, and that you're bringing in people to do the lower level training.
Yeah, I think I'm finding similar as well. I'm currently doing an engagement where kind of the senior leadership on the engineering side is pretty much non-existent, because it is one of those startups that very organically formed and kind of just struggling to scale up now. And that's part of what I'm doing with them. One thing I find helps with all aspects, including hiring, is I always start my engagements with a short discovery process. It's a structured process. I look at everything from tech to processes to hiring, etc. And then you can kind of document and outline the gaps you find. And so you have a really kind of almost engineering driven way of showing kind of the stakeholders where the gaps are, and getting a lot of buy-in to fill that gaps, whether it's through coaching or identifying key roles that are missing, which is what I've done with my recent engagement, where there are clear key roles that are missing, and we've started looking for people as well. Because you're there temporarily as a fractional or an interim, and you want to fix not just kind of what's happening now, but you want to kind of embed things so that they survive post your engagement. And the only way to do that is to kind of build those foundational skill sets within the team.
Yeah, I think the best way I heard it described is that that you've done your job well when you're basically fire yourself that you're not needed. You've built everything and got the leadership in place. But there was one thing there, Khalil. It's a very big cheeky ask, I suppose. But this discovery process, is that something you can anonymize or summarize and share possibly?
I think we've chatted about this on Slack before.
Okay.
If I'm not wrong, Mark. But yeah. I mean, I'm happy to, if you want to kind of have a chat offline. And yeah, I'm definitely happy to share kind of what my processes are.
That's great. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Okay. That's a really interesting point. Just like to unpack a little bit there, Khalil, about building things that will exist long after you. Such an important part if you're going to kind of do your job properly, to think not just about that, but what's, setting up for the future. Any tips for say we've got someone on the call that's listening that is just about to enter their first fractional engagement and is going to walk into maybe a bit of chaos and that kind of thing, and is going to have to try and prioritize a bunch of different things, but trying to think about that long term after they've left. Any tips for how to do that from a hiring perspective?
Yeah. I think my biggest tip would be one kind of a perspective tip, really, in terms of how to look at your engagement, because then that drives everything else. And especially if you're coming from a perm background, but even if you're coming from an interim background, you're likely more a planner and a doer, right? You want to go in, get your hands dirty, start fixing things. I think part of the thing that hits you first when you start kind of doing more fractional engagements, because you have less contact time with the people you're helping, is that there's a big element of it that is kind of the role of an educator. So you need to come in and you need to also try and, based on your experience and based on very real examples, get people to understand why certain things need to be done. But you need to do that a lot more efficiently than when you're an interim or a perm. So what I find is that focusing heavily at the beginning on that educational piece and kind of doing it step by step and demonstrating the value of the changes that you're making, you know, within kind of a short-term period, but then kind of extrapolating them into the long term. That's how you make a real impact, and also make your job a lot easier as you move forward, because people understand where you're coming from.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I can see that. Ryan, would you add anything at all to that?
Yeah, so some builds there is on the theme of, you know, creating the systems or the ways of working. Is certainly for, you know, for my current client, I'm currently focused on actually putting in the sort of the guardrails in terms of the recruitment process itself. So for each role that we're hiring, sort of making sure that, you know, everyone's got a shared understanding of, okay, what are the expectations of that role, what's the kind of experience and capabilities we're looking for, and then have objective ways to assess for that capability. So putting in the interview guidelines, the scorecards, the objective measures, and that education piece, making sure that everyone understands the rationale behind it. And then you're essentially the artifact that your client has then is your codified wisdom. So it's a way to sort of scale yourself across that organization. That's even more important when you're a fractional, because, as I say, you might only be there 2 days a week, and what you don't want to happen is in those 3 days you're not there, people are reverting back to what they've done before. You need the guardrails and the sort of the processes in place, such that when you're not in the room, the right decisions are getting made.
The scoring part is actually quite significant. That really resonates with me as well, because what you'll see a lot of times in places that are less developed is that they'll be scoring different interviews in different ways, and it's hard to have that consistency. And so, you know, even just standardizing the questions that are being asked, having some kind of idea of, you know, weighting of each question and what a good answer looks like, enables you to kind of also disconnect a lot more from the process and have a more oversight role, because other people can kind of follow those instructions and you have a more unbiased process. Some of the biggest struggle that I've found, especially in the education bit, is making people understand how biased their hiring process actually is. And, you know, from a perspective of either, you know, whether that be the candidate's background or the candidate's education or experience, etc. You know, I'm a big fan of anonymous CV reviews as well, of just kind of cleaning up all demographic data and having just CV next to CV, at least at the beginning as well.
Yeah, I can really see how putting some decent time and investment into that education, rather than kind of waiting for it to, you know, trying to jump in straight away, and then when things go wrong, trying to unpick them. I can imagine if you've only got this short space of time, how important that's going to be at making sure it all works. Okay, so can you just go into a little bit more, each of you, on your roles within the hiring team, your roles within the project, to what extent you're obviously a strategist seems to be quite common in what you guys are doing there. But what level of decision making on the individual hires you have, and what you don't have when you're in this role?
So from my perspective, it's so it's definitely in that sort of strategist sort of section, sort of guiding the overall process. In terms of the hiring decisions, once you've got the scorecards in place, it then becomes a sort of in my experience, it's like a panel sort of review. It's you look at, okay, well, you review the whole interview loop, and then it'll be it's what does the objective assessment say? It's not you as an individual saying it's a hire. It's like what is the process telling us? What is the assessment telling us? And that makes it much easier. And then it also helps with helps the team felt buy in that this sort of interim or fractional isn't making the decision. It's like they've put the systems in place to allow the team to make or the perm team to make a sensible decision. So it sort of reinforces the systems you put in place, reinforce the fact that you're not becoming the sort of the linchpin. You're becoming an enabling force and allowing people to make good, sensible decisions.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think also it's really important to not involve yourself in kind of the every detail of the interview process, because then you build that dependency on yourself, and you want to start building kind of that team's independence from the beginning. So I actually try not to conduct or drive the interviews. At the beginning, I'll sit in on some, which will give you really good kind of feedback for the interviewing team, until at least kind of they're used to the whole process and used to doing it. I do like the panel review for the decision process at the end, and especially if it's based on objective scoring, etc. There's always going to be some appeal to the emotional side in really kind of deciding who you make an offer to and not, but you want to reduce that as much as possible. And having the kind of panel group discussion usually drives out a lot of the personal biases as well. So I think that's a good way to handle it. What I would add, though, is that if you need to understand also the kind of the level of seniority of the candidates that you're hiring, and also the level of structure within the company. So it's quite different when it's a startup of like 6-7 people still, or when it's a company with hundreds of people. So what I would say is, when you're actually initially helping design that process, you need to, if it's a smaller company, you need to keep in mind how that process is going to scale as they grow, and actually make sure that you're having those discussions with the management and with the hiring team, so that it doesn't just break, especially if you leave before the company grows a lot.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Can I ask, do you see much difference in terms of these different projects that you've been in, the different kind of companies that you've worked for as a fractional? Have you seen it's kind of followed a similar pattern in the way that you've approached hiring now within these companies, or are you finding it's completely different and you do have to kind of mold a little bit to the way that they work?
In my experience, it's been very common, and I'm sort of in terms of the whole scorecard approach, I'm sort of building up sort of a playbook there. The difference is going to be more around the local company policy. So some will be, yes, we're happy to use external recruitment partners. Some will be have restrictions about either volume or the amount of agency sort of spend they have. So there's some little tweaking around the kind of the operational levers you have for talent attraction, and then of course some companies are more advanced in the attraction piece. So they've got a much more developed employee value proposition, so it makes it easier to go to market. So the key difference is the level of maturity you find versus the actual approach in my experience.
Yeah, and I think the value proposition bit is really interesting, actually, because if I just jump off from that, I find it's quite different from when it's a more established company versus a startup. Because with the more established company, you have all of these benefits and bonuses and stuff that could be the driving factor of getting someone in. But you get in slightly different profile of person than when it's a startup, and the main hook is, oh, you can shape it and you can get equity. That tends to drive in a different profile of candidate, usually a bit of more entrepreneurial candidate, but also maybe a less kind of a more people who are more difficult to manage sometimes because of that kind of entrepreneurial spirit. And so I think you need to recognize that, and you need to, when you're actually shortlisting people, for example, you need to really consider what the value proposition you're presenting to the market is, because you can waste a lot of time interviewing the wrong types of people, even if they're skilled and have good experience, but that either they're not going to accept an offer at the level you're making, or even worse, they'll accept it, but then expect different things once they arrive. And so you need to be really clear with candidates as well of, okay, this is what life here is like.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and as a build on that, I try to use the job ads to really convey that and to sort of really paint the picture as to, you know, what the culture is like, what the day-to-day is like, you know, the kind of work people will be doing, the kind of progression that they might see as an individual, just to minimize the fact that you're getting people into the funnel that, you know, you find out later down the road are not a fit. Let's try and filter out sort of lack of fit because of the environment or because of the company stage, you know, up front as soon as possible.
Brilliant. Okay. Challenges. Are there any common big challenges that you've come across when you've come in any part of this? Like, it's all the way you're painting it so far sounds really easy. This is, you know, something you guys are easily coping with, but have you found that you've experienced any frictions around the edges or any big challenges? Ryan, I'll go to you first.
Yes, so challenge number one is often budget. So sometimes there can be the expectation may be different in terms of, you know, there's a pot of money and someone's expectations to what they can get with that pot of money might be very different from the reality. Certainly, you know, the sort of the huge market shifts we've seen over the last couple of years. So sometimes that can be a bit of a challenge initially when the ask is for this very senior technical leader, and the sort of the statement earlier around, you know, a client having sort of not having the technical leadership in place that they needed. Those first technical hires that are experienced compared to existing team members will look very expensive. So there's often some challenging and robust conversations around, you know, why you have to pay a certain level for a particular kind of skill set. So that's a challenge number one. Challenge number two is you know, competing in a market where, you know, whilst, you know, we're seeing that you know, we're in a bit of a sort of an unfortunate sort of time at the moment with big tech and they're closing the doors and unfortunately people are being let go. Equally, there are still lots of companies that over the last couple of years haven't hired the talent they wanted to hire, and so now there's still lots of competition for the talent that is out there. So it's that, how do you differentiate yourself from everyone else that's hiring, even in a market that's maybe a bit cooler than it has been historically? So yeah, budget and attraction, they're the key challenges.
Yeah, I think I would echo that, especially around attraction, because that can be very challenging depending on the type of market that you're hiring in. You know, sometimes, I mean, I remember a few years ago, it was almost impossible to hire anyone because if you didn't make an offer after the first interview, they were gone, you know, and now it's a bit different. And I think you need to kind of be pragmatic and adjust your hiring strategies based on what you're actually seeing in the market. You know, the whole perfect is the enemy of good situation. So you definitely need to be aware of market conditions when you put together packages, but also when you put together your process. So that's a big one for sure. The other challenge around budget, Ryan, just to kind of jump off on that, sometimes the way I frame it to kind of management is that, okay, you know, you can save a little bit of money here, but it's going to cost us further down the line. And, you know, their opportunity cost is a very real thing, whereas you can invest potentially, you know, slightly more and get an outsized result out of that, and also make sure that you retain this talent that you very sorely need.
Yeah, and on the budget side of things, there's you know, there's a number of sort of benchmarking tools that you can use, and what I found is that it's educating people on how to use those tools. So I've just recently been through an exercise where, you know, we just forgot about, in the first instance, we forgot about job titles. We put those to the side, and we just looked at, okay, well, what is the scope and the impact and the remit of this role? Is it a team? Is it a single team? Is it an organization? And when we put that into the model, we got much more favorable sort of salaries coming out of the benchmarking than we would have if we'd have just put in the the role titles. As we know on this call, one company's engineering manager is a single team. Another company's engineering manager is someone looking after a whole department. So by focusing on the responsibilities and the scope and the influence, really helps you get the favorable data out of those benchmarking packages. The other thing you need to remember is that they can lag considerably. They might be 9 months out, so you do need to blend what the benchmarking tools are telling you, what your intel from recruiters, and sort of also to a degree candidate expectation.
Yeah, I mean, benchmarking, that's important because sometimes companies forget that you don't just use the benchmarking when you're hiring. You also need to keep using it for the people you have to retain. I mean, one time I did an interim, I think it was an 11 months interim stint with a company where they were bleeding people out before I arrived. And after I joined, we lost just one person in those 11 months because I came in and I did a salary review. And I noticed that everyone was slightly less than what you would actually have kind of on the market now. And when I kind of asked what was going on, they're like, oh, we have salary benchmarks, here they are. And they were about 4 years old. And this industry moves really quickly. So just adjusting everyone to the current averages, helped retention hugely, but it also gave the engineers the confidence that, okay, this guy is coming in and he's fighting our side. And, that drives them to stay as well. I think retention needs to be a key part of your hiring strategy too, because high churn is very expensive. And so you need to look at it from both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. And the sort of a build there is that all the things you look at to attract people, you need to, remind people of those things, on a regular basis, and reinforce them for the people that you have.
Great, thanks both. Right, Mike, I can see you've had your hand up for a while, and then Richard, I'll come to you shortly afterwards.
That's on my head. That's a virtual hand, so I'm not doing the Penny Mordaunt with the sword there. Guys, I'm interested in trends. And when you've been working in your current businesses or the previous ones, first of all, the trend towards Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, having the folks at the desk, or is the trend away to more dynamic and flexible and now global ways of working? And then the second trend I'm interested in is around how and where you go to find talent. You've mentioned internal recruitment teams, but is it still the use of professional recruiters? Is it going directly through LinkedIn in some shape or form? Is it your personal networks, bringing in folks that have been successful with you in the past and leveraging that? So 2 trends, interested in your feedback and thoughts on what you're seeing and feeling in the market.
So the first point on sort of remote, hybrid, sort of in office, the general trend I'm seeing is one towards sort of hybrid. Certainly in my network and the companies I've been working with are broadly work from home or work remotely, 4 to 3 days a week and 1 to 2 days a week in the office. That seems to be the established sort of practice. I'm seeing a lot of resistance to going full remote for a number of reasons. I think there's a general concern around the kind of the cultural embedding of people if they're not coming to the office very, very, very regularly. And I think there is that notion of the challenges that different time zones can create. If you've got like a core sort of working hours, then you need to sort of change. Essentially, you'd have to change the company to sort of be async first to sort of tap into broader remote markets outside of your time zone, which is why I think most people have sort of settled on this hybrid middle ground. What are your thoughts, Khalil?
I agree, but I think there are 2 parallel trends emerging from what I've seen. One is, as you mentioned, kind of 1 to 2 days in the office per week, and you have most of your meetings or collaborative work, etc., during those days. The other strong trend I've seen, and it's always either or, is remote first, but then meeting once or twice a month, but having like a big workshop conference type situation. So rather than just coming into an office and doing normal work, it'll be more geared to the creative thinking. So these are the two distinct trends that I've seen shaping up in the market.
And then the second point was around sort of talent attraction. So of course, in some ways, I sort of have an old-fashioned approach to this. That my immediate port of call is always my immediate network. So people I've worked with in the past, and I'll always reach out to them in the first instance. I think these days, you know, it's like finding a blend. There's a number of sort of talent partners that I've worked with over the years that I know and I trust, and they'll always be a first sort of port of call. Equally, there's reaching out on LinkedIn and reaching out directly. So whether that's you directly or other engineering leaders in your organization, that can be very powerful. People respond very well to direct contact from people in the engineering team. I was chatting to someone the other day, and they were just getting really excited, and they said, "Oh, this is so good to talk to someone at the company, and I'm hearing it firsthand. I've not had to, you know, have a couple of conversations with different people, but it is time consuming." And then, of course, there's, you know, going to events. There's hosting events in your offices, tapping into the communities that are doing the kind of work that you want people to come and do in your organizations, whether that's, you know, Slack communities, whether it's some of the, you know, the bigger conferences. Like if you're looking for front end people, it's I'm a bit out of touch with conferences since COVID, but they used to be full frontal down in Brighton. So yeah, it's using a variety of sort of channels, but don't underestimate the sort of the personal approach.
Yeah, no, definitely personal. Always kind of, especially if you're targeting specific talent, like a senior guy that you would really like to get in, that's the way to go about it. It's definitely the personal approach, because they feel a lot more kind of paid attention to. I tend to use a mix as well, same as Ryan, of kind of recruiters that I've worked with before, that I know are good, that I know are going to bring in quality candidates. You know, I think all of us have been in this industry long enough that we have a lot of kind of contacts within recruitment, and we know who delivers and who doesn't. So that's one that I use. But also, I think personal network, especially when it comes to kind of if you're doing early stage startups, I think engineers, really strong leaders, et cetera, that I've worked with before that I know would be excited about the domain, I'll tend to reach out to as well, personally. And, you know, they're less of an unknown quantity. You know their strengths, you know their weaknesses, because you've likely worked with them before. So I tend to depend more on that for at least the early stage startup side of things, just because they'll deliver, you know, a lot more value than you're actually investing in. The third one, though, is I mean, sometimes I do recommend not hiring and actually bringing in, you know, a really good outsourced team. That's usually when the funds are low, or it's a seed funded startup that needs to raise, and they don't know quite how much they're going to raise, you know, before they scale up the team, etc. I do tend to depend on also kind of people who provide development teams that I've worked with and trust before. Obviously, this is a very dangerous area because there's a lot out there and a lot who just don't deliver. And so as long as you know you've had the experience with them, you know they deliver, you know that their team is going to be treated as almost an internal team and have the same processes and have the same communication, then that's a viable option until you have more clarity on budget or until you kind of raise more budget.
Yeah, and another channel I didn't mention earlier is the sort of the rise of the various sort of platforms that basically operate as marketplaces. So people, you know, saying, you know, here are their skills, this is the salary they're looking for. You can go on those platforms, you can sort of search for you know, people who are, you know, actively looking, and you can sort of you know, tailor for your price point and experience points. So they've been a good source of Cord is the one that comes to mind that we've been using recently. That's found some good people on there.
Thanks, Mike, for the question. Thanks, Ryan and Khalil. Okay, Richard, you had a question a little while back about IR35. Did you want to come on and ask that?
Yeah, I don't know much about this area, but it was something that came up on Tuesday night. If you're recruiting for people, are you working inside or outside of IR35? Is there an issue there if you're heavily involved in the recruitment?
So IR35 is like, I find it an incredibly grey sort of piece of legislation. I think the key thing here is that if we tie it back to our previous conversation, it's like a lot of the work that we're doing is we're putting in the processes, the frameworks to allow a decision to be made. My understanding of the legislation is that if you're directly managing those people that are being brought in, or you're seen to be, you know, the sole decision maker, I think that's where it starts to get into, you know, the sort of the employee, a disguised employee kind of situation. But I think if you can sort of show that you are putting the processes in place, that the hiring decision is not resting with you, it's resting with the process and the wider team, and you know, if you can show that you're not line managing those people, then I don't see there being a compliance issue with working, you know, strategically in this space.
Yeah,
but always take legal advice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, caveat, this is not legal advice. But I think as long as you're structured your engagement contractually in kind of the right way, and also that you're just careful not to keep the actual engagement within that legal structure that you've set up, rather than it just being kind of this, yeah, this is for IR35 and then we're going to do things differently, then you should be okay. But yeah, IR35 is one of those things like, you know, it's like those laws that are meant to just catch people out. No matter what you do, someone's going to think that, you know, this is not within IR35 or this is within IR35. And I think if you look at the people who have been kind of prosecuted, you know, it's really inconsistent. The actual judgments and results are super inconsistent. So it seems to also be very open to interpretation. So I think the takeaway really is have good insurance.
Cool, thank you.
Have good insurance and get legal advice. I like it. Okay, Ricardo, are you still with us? Yes, Ricardo, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. It's really more about prioritization at the different parts of the hiring strategy. I can imagine with a relatively short-term and intermittent engagement, the pressure is on getting the hires in as opposed to anything else. But I've often found, especially when I've built out teams, that a lot of emphasis from good candidates comes from long-term career path development. And I'm wondering how you balance that out in terms of prioritization, because presumably if you've come in as a fractional, there isn't much in place in terms of that. So where do you place that in terms of the prioritization when it comes to building out a hiring strategy?
So it's a really great question. And so career maps or progression frameworks are a really important tool for a variety of factors. They clarify expectations. They provide people with a progression path, so it's really good for retention. I've got a little bit of a cheat here in that a trap some people fall into is when they look at their career progression frameworks, they sort of go all in and they create these frameworks and they've got like 30 different dimensions. So my sort of hack is to just do what I call a thin slice progression framework and just get the levels in place and get the broad sort of responsibility and sort of scope of ownership. So you can sort of say, okay, tech lead or is a single squad, engineering manager, multiple squads, a director is running an org, and that way you get to balance having sort of clarity of expectation, a sense of progression. But it's the kind of thing you can do in a team, sort of a half a day, and just get those sort of distinct levels in place without having to go through, you know, well, what are the 30 different dimensions of expectation? I'm increasingly thinking that they do more harm than good, because it promotes a checklist mentality. So I think by doing that thin slice progression framework, you're sort of you can operate at speed, but then also you get the benefits of clarity of expectation, and retention off the back of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think part of having two of us on here is to contrast opinions, but I seem to be agreeing with Ryan a lot. I definitely agree on this because heavyweight frameworks just like they do promote a culture of kind of box ticking, and I've worked in a lot of companies where that was the case. The thing about this though is this is the biggest challenge for a scale up when you're going from startup to kind of a bigger team to having a clear vision of your future. That's where you really need to put these frameworks in place and need to put kind of at least that idea of what progression looks like in place. And so and I think founders that are turning into kind of more, CEO and COO types, they struggle with this. So I think as a fractional, there's a big, again, going back to education, there's a big educational element for the kind of the high level management for the founders, et cetera, in just the importance of having these things in place, because they often get ignored and they're a big reason that retention goes down when you grow. The other thing is I also don't like to kind of paint everyone with a broad brush. So I like to understand individually, to allow people to individually set their progression plans, sort of. It's like, because it's not always necessarily, this guy's an engineer and then he wants to be a principal engineer, or he wants to get into management. Some people don't want to touch management, and I don't blame them. And people often think like the progression is, you go up and then you hit CTO and it's like, the ultimate. And I always tell people that, why do you even want this job? It's not a good job. It's very difficult. And it's not technical, and you'll start not doing very technical things a lot. So if you are interested in the strategy and the business side, yeah, that could be a good progression path for you. But I think also defining kind of, what are the opportunities? How can I develop, and how can I develop my career? And having that clear and maybe documented somewhere or giving workshops on it is quite valuable, because people often have an overly linear way of thinking about these things.
Brilliant. Thanks both. Does that answer your question, Ricardo? Did you have any follow-up on that?
It does, thank you. It sounds as if the education piece and emphasizing the importance of career development is probably the most important thing to do in the early stages when you're building out the strategy. So as long as people know that they have to do it, it doesn't hold you back from actually starting, kicking off a hiring process.
Fantastic. Okay. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left. Any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. One thing I would like to talk about just briefly in closing here. We've obviously, so we ran a fractional unconference on Wednesday. A big part of what came up from a load of people is that not enough companies are aware of the fractional offering, what the word means, and what a fractional CTO might do, for example. So I'd love to, just while I've got you guys here, just ask if you've got some kind of through some case studies, some work that you've done. Khalil, I know you mentioned there about a company that went from losing people to not losing many at all. So just who is this right for? Which companies should now that maybe have never hired fractional, don't really know what this is about? Who should start thinking about this? What can you bring? Is anyone happy to share some case studies without naming names or anything about what's been done?
I think most startups should consider fractional. And actually the earlier stage you are, the more you should actually consider fractional instead of getting your mate who's really technical to be your CTO, because at least you get things set up properly from the beginning. And you're investing relatively very little to get an outsized effect on your company as you grow. Getting a permanent CTO at the early stage, I think, is never the right thing almost. A head of engineering as you grow maybe, but a CTO is a very strategic role, and it can easily be done in this fractional way because it's a strategic role. It's rarely a very heavily operational role unless you're just starting and setting things up. I don't know, Ryan, do you agree? Or
So I definitely agree with the sort of the early startups are a great candidate, because there's we will all know people that have been through a rapid growth journey in a startup, and maybe they've had their first tech lead role, maybe they've had their first CTO role, and they've experienced some form of burnout because they weren't supported or equipped to do that role effectively. I think that the value of having a fractional in that instance is you've got someone that can provide that credibility to investors, to the wider board, and you can grow a permanent person who's in the business and help them grow into the role. So you bring a fractional in, you don't need to give away equity, and you're able to invest in someone that you want to be with you on a long-term journey, helping you build your business, because there's nothing more heartbreaking for a founder than they discover that they've broken the person that helped them build the business.
Yeah, the coaching part actually is a really significant bit of why a fractional can really help with a startup or a scale up, because you're building kind of, it's the same as we talked about with the hiring process earlier, but in every aspect of kind of the tech strategy.
Another area or home ground I think is particularly suitable for fractional as well is companies that are scaling up very fast. So if you are in a hypergrowth sort of scale up, all of your sort of incumbent engineering leaders, they have more than enough on their plates to sort of deliver the product. And so bringing in a fractional CTO that can rather than work in engineering, works on engineering and gets in things like the recruitment practices, gets in the career ladders, gets in the sort of works on broader sort of high performance culture and coaching incumbent leaders. I think that can be a really nice sort of sweet spot, because in any hypergrowth environment, no matter how well skilled the leaders are, they will be overwhelmed.
Transformation as well, not just hypergrowth. So
yeah,
if you've
precisely.
recognized you have issues in the business, and you keep bringing in permanent people who get embedded into the company culture and then kind of take on these issues. I've seen this recently, actually. It's a lot better to get someone in who's fractional, who can kind of have a real outsider's perspective and do that education piece and do that analysis and see where your gaps are and how you can achieve that transformation. And also because by the nature of fractional work, you're seeing a lot more that's happening in the market, and then you're able to kind of use that synergistically to inform your current engagement.
Yes, it's a really great point on the transformational piece. There are some transformational roles where I sometimes refer to it as the sacrificial consultant, where sometimes you need someone independent to have the conversations or make some change that maybe a permanent person would be maybe frightened politically to do so. Or maybe frightened's the wrong word, but would be maybe tentative.
Brilliant. Okay, right, 4 minutes to go. I'm just going to ask if you've got any final tips on one final part, then hiring your replacement. When it's time to go, I guess you've just alluded to that in terms of growing your replacement where possible. And I think that's obviously a great way that you can do that if there is somebody within the business. If there isn't that person that you can coach to that kind of position, how do you go about hiring somebody that will be your permanent replacement when it is time to go?
So a key question here is or key consideration is understanding what kind of trajectory is the company on, because what you don't want to do is hire someone that can handle the current state organization, but is going to be ill-equipped to deal with the 1 year, 2 year time. So it's really understanding, working with whether it's the CEO or maybe there's a perm CTO, understanding what is the trajectory. What does the team look like in 2 years, and making sure that you bring on a leader that can take the where you are today to that next place. The other interesting thing I find is that as a fractional or interim, you're in a quite unique position in that you've actually been doing the job. Often, if there's say an incumbent CTO and they're looking to bring in a VP of engineering, for instance, the chances are they probably haven't been doing that exact job because they've just been so swamped with other things. So it can work really well in that you can be talking to candidates and you can be giving them a real clear picture of, okay, this is the role, this is the challenges, this is what's going to be needed. And so it can work well in terms of expectation settings and finding the right fit, because you've just got that intimate knowledge of the job and what's needed.
I agree with also the don't hire for that current challenge or the challenge that you were brought on to fix, because hopefully you've kind of sorted that out by the time you leave and can hand over something in a much better state. I've actually had to do this, hire my replacement at the role that I mentioned, where when I joined, they were kind of bleeding out people. And my focus really was on a couple of things. One, find someone who could handle the actual tech space they were in, because it was it was around computer vision and machine learning, but specifically as applies to kind of security and investigations and things like that. So getting someone with a background that understands the domain, I think, is highly valuable as well, because as a CTO, you need to kind of work within the business strategy as well as tech, and domain knowledge is hugely important for a permanent CTO, much more so than someone who's coming in as a transformational CTO. So that's where I really focused on as well. Plus, you find the right psychological profile for the type of company that it is as well. Is it someone who can handle a really high pressure environment if it is a high pressure environment, or is it someone who's creative when it's a creative environment, etc. So it's not just around kind of the technical experience and skills. A lot of it for me has to do with the person.
Brilliant. Ryan, Khalil, just closing in on 4. Rajani, sorry, I don't think we're going to get to your question, but I will put you in touch with Ryan and Khalil so that they can answer that directly afterwards. Guys, thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. Massive thanks, obviously, to Ryan and Khalil. I'll be following up in the next few days just for a bit of feedback and that kind of thing. But yeah, please stick involved. If you're not already a member of the community, then we'll drop you a link so that you can sign up and join. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it today, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thanks for having us, Barry. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening.